So welcome, friends, to session 4 of our travel through the story of Moses and looking at it more intently with an idea that as someone that was such a reluctant servant of God, it gives each one of us a unique perspective on our own sense of call and our own possibility as being a servant of God. So we found so far that Moses is just a wonderful test case for our own humanity, and yet also our own power, our own ability to rise above either real limitation or self-imposed limitation with the Spirit of God kind of supporting us and guiding us. And today is no different. So last week we moved through the Exodus story, the 10 plagues, and then the dramatic crossing of what is more properly called the Sea of Reeds. And today we're going to look at this idea of the creation of what we call the 10 Commandments. So after that dramatic passing over the sea and the armies of Egypt are washed over, you have this. It begins this journey, and it starts off with celebration and worship and feasting, all these wonderful things. And then it quickly starts to devolve into complaint. They're still doing what Moses is asking, but the people, they're lifting their voices increasingly in discontent. It takes about roughly, according to the stories, about 3 months to travel roughly 200 miles. Their aim is to end up at Mount Sinai, okay? Mount Sinai is where Moses originally told Pharaoh he wanted to take the people, if you remember. And initially he just said, listen, just let us go temporarily. We want to worship our God there, because that was where Moses had his experience. The burning bush experience. But then it became the place that was their destination place. So it takes them 3 months to get there, and they sit there camped for another 11 months or so. Okay. And in this time, Moses is continually going up the mountain, and God is meeting him there. And it's all this dramatic imagery and language about smoke and thunder and lightning. And yet the text says that they meet as one face to face, kind of like people would meet. It's a very beautiful image, a very powerful image. And so as you may recall, Moses will then go up and down many times and continually report back to the people. And ultimately this reporting gets shaped into what we call the 10 Commandments. The chapters 19 to 40 in Exodus are all set at the base of Mount Sinai, okay? The entire book of Leviticus is as well, and the first portion, the first 10 chapters of Numbers are as well. So it's a central location. But I want to say a couple things about the name Sinai, and there's some confusion here. You know, you may have heard, because we've covered Genesis and Exodus and some of these early books of the Torah, you may recall that there are different authors, different vantage points for writing these stories. There's a Yahwist and an Elohist and a priestly account. You may or may not recall exactly. I'm not going to get into that too deeply, but just know that there are stories reflected from each of these different authors. And you can tell because they all use different names. So the Yahwist will refer to God as Yahweh. The Elohist will refer to God as Elohim. We generally conflate them, but there really are two different accounts. And that's why you will often see, for example, there are 2 flood stories. The Noah flood stories. There are 2 accounts of the creation of the 10 Commandments. And so they sort of conflate them. And in this case, I bring it up because Mount Sinai is a reference to a mountain that is from the Yahwist perspective. That's only a name that author uses. The Elohist calls it Mount Horeb. Now, Mount Sinai, they don't really know what it actually means. They think it pertains to either the valley of Shin, where this was all set. There's also a city in Canaan that's called Shin. There's a moon god that is named roughly that, but also the word seneh in Hebrew means burning bush. So that may well, somewhere in there, there's some connection. Horeb means glowing, and that also is probably a reference to burning bush. So regardless of the names, they generally are accepted to kind of refer to the same place, even though there's not an agreement. There is a Mount Sinai today, and pilgrims hike it all the time, but we're not absolutely sure that that's the same one as the biblical one. Okay, that's just not clear. There are about 10 different potential options for mountains that are all around the Sinai Peninsula. So anyway, that's part of it, but it's a crucial area. It's a place where Moses went up to get inspiration to connect with God. Later on, centuries later, Elijah returns to Mount Sinai in a time of desperation on the part of Israel, and goes up the mountain to kind of meet with God, to kind of to find inspiration. So anyway, it's an important place. Regardless of where it actually is, it's an important theological place. So today we're going to look at sort of the fruits of Sinai, and we'll look more at the Ten Commandments themselves. I want to look at the Ten Commandments as kind of a vision. What is the vision that they present? What's the what are they? When we step back, we'll read them, and then we'll look back and say, what is this really talking about? Okay. And then we'll look at them a little more closely and kind of see how challenging they can be for all times, but really we'll consider our own time and see where we are particularly challenged by what these commandments are talking about. And then we'll reflect on how we might respond to them in this in our modern context. So we're really going to take a look, kind of get our fingers into the soil of the Ten Commandments today. So with that as the background, are there any questions or comments that you have about either what I've shared so far or about any previous classes?
I'd like to make a comment. There is a comedian, Lewis Black, and he is Jewish. I don't know if anyone's familiar with him. One time I heard him say that the 10 Commandments were created for a group of people that needed it very badly. If there was any group of people that needed 10 Commandments, it was the Jewish people, he says.
Well, I suppose that's true. And I think what we'll see today is that it really isn't just applicable to them. I also like Mel Brooks's take on it, where originally there were 15, but he dropped one of them because they were a little unwieldy. So we ended up with 10. But yeah, it's a powerful story, and in some ways, to parody a story like this, I think, is also a sign of its influence, of its significance in our culture. So I don't look at parody as being as kind of being disrespectful so much. It's more a badge of honor, I suppose. Anyone else? Any other comments about the Ten Commandments, or about just, I don't know, ideas you've had about the Ten Commandments? What you've been taught about the Ten Commandments previously?
I think that they are in some of the public buildings, and I know that there's been some discussion about that, whether they should be there or not, or is it a cross between separation of church and state. But I think and I can't recall if they're at the Supreme Court or not. I'm trying to think what she's holding, but I know that some other buildings for certain they're there.
Yeah, it's been a point of contention for a long time that in our country, while we value what various religious traditions offer as their sort of central teachings and visions, and I think a lot of us would get behind the basic message of the Ten Commandments, it does push that button of church and state on which our country was founded, because they saw how when they fled England, how the combination of king and religion could be quite oppressive. and certainly seeing how it worked out in Rome. So they were very sensitive to that. And that's been an ongoing conversation, as Bonnie points out. I don't know the answer to your question. I do not think the 10 Commandments are at the Supreme Court, but I think it was more on the local levels that they were having them or having those conversations. Ken, and then Jane.
During the 1950s, when the 10 Commandments movie came out, there were about 260 10 Commandments installations that were done all around the country, and many of them were sponsored by Cecil B. DeMille as a way of helping to promote the movie.
Oh, my.
Oh, wow. No, it's very interesting. And, I know it's a place of sort of, debate, but, back then I think it was a different time. And so I look at that. Yes, perhaps it's marketing. So maybe there is a little cynicism there, but I think that's fascinating. And I wonder then, Ken, what happened to them? What became of them, if they remain, or how many of them still remain? What became of them? Do you know?
The monuments are still there, and many of them are in public locations, and there, some of them there's controversy, and there's been efforts to remove some of them.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Jane, did you have something you wanted to add to?
I haven't really thought about this before, but the 10 Commandments are very central when I was raised in the Protestant church, and as were many Old Testament Bible stories, even though in the New Testament we have Jesus and scripture talking about the greatest commandments, love God, love yourself, love your neighbor, and things like that. The 10 Commandments were still very much held up as a standard for living, for right living. So, pretty key to our Christian faith, I think.
Absolutely, they are, and it's important for us to remember. I think what you're raising this point kind of reminds me of this. There are not only 10 commandments. There never were. There were like 640 commandments or something like that. So these 10 commandments are kind of a distilling. Think of them as a top 10, really, in some ways. And when we get into them more, we'll see why. We'll see a little bit more why. But they are not the only commandments. And that's why when that question was posed to Jesus, it wasn't just him sort of trying to distill the 10 commandments. He was distilling the whole tradition and trying to say, all right, what's most essential? That whole idea of loving God, loving neighbor. But thank you, Jane. Ken, you have a follow-up, and then Boyce?
I assume you're probably going to address the fact that there's a Protestant version of the 10 Commandments and a Catholic version. There's a different listing of the numbers of the commandments.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I was going to mention, are you referring to the first commandment in particular? I am the Lord your God, that one?
No, there's just the numbering of them, and I think it's between the fourth and the fifth or something or other, where the numbering varies.
Yeah, we'll look at it a little bit, but sorry, I keep getting all these notifications. We'll look at that some, and if I don't address it in the way, maybe you can point it out, because when we read them, you can kind of maybe highlight where that is. I'm looking at them more in terms of the overall vision that they're creating. But I hope we can get to that too, for sure. Boyce, did you have something?
Yeah, I just find it interesting that it appears in the Christian Bible of the 10 Commandments, but it seems that they are universally used and accepted throughout the world, whether it's a religion or not religion, because I think every country has laws that address, or court rulings that address those 10 commandments if somebody is caught doing them, I guess. It's not just Christian countries that are using them. It's every country in the world. It's so universal.
Well, and I think you're raising a good point. First of all, they would be Jewish primarily, and then adopted by the ongoing testimony, the testament that created the Christian church. But for sure, I think what you're naming is they're not so much religious commandments. They're sort of like the basic fabric of society kind of commandments. And I think we'll get into that as we look at them more closely. And you can kind of see what Boyce is saying, that there's a universal quality about these that must have been developed over generations, that these are sort of like, all right, these bottom line kind of things. Okay. But bottom line, to what end? That's what I want to get into. What is it that why did they pick these particular things that we could all agree are more universal in scope?
Well, it was quoted in our reading that God was passing on to Moses to tell the Jews, the Israelites, that if they obey him and the Ten Commandments, they will live long and prosper.
That's right. That's right. So that's part of it. And we want to look at then, what is that dynamic that's being created, and why? Why would these ones be the ones that would promote our greatest prosperity? Because I think we can discern that by looking at it more closely. Bonnie?
Wasn't Moses up on Mount Sinai when the Israelites, for lack of another word, were worshiping, was it Babel or Balaam, I guess? And they
that's
were
when they created the golden
calf and all that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think, he comes down and says, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And I guess it just kind of took off from what they were doing. And, oh, by the way, don't steal and don't kill anybody, and honor your parents, and like you say, universal things. But like they were going off in a different direction, it seemed like.
Well, remember this: when were these stories written down? They were written down when they were in exile in Babylon. So it's very important to have the lens of the Babylonian exile as one of the filters through which we look at these stories, because all of these things pertain to how do we maintain identity, our Jewish identity, our Jewish covenant, our relationship with God in a foreign land, in a place that's so cosmopolitan. There are so many different cultures, so many different religions, so many different possibilities that could be very distracting, that could be very diffusing to our identity. How do we preserve that? So these things, yes, they're written in the context of Moses kind of wandering down and seeing them, create the golden calf. But that golden calf may also be a proxy for what the Jewish people are experiencing in Babylon, where there were so many other golden calves to worship. And the beautiful thing and the way these images work is that we know there remain golden calves in our own society. And what are they? To be identified, because our own experience, it changes, and yet it doesn't change. The same temptations, the same distractions exist for us. And I think often the same results, where it can be quite destructive. And so when we look at the intentions of these, the real intentions underneath the Ten Commandments, we start to understand better why it is that when we abide by them, we, as Bob said, live long and prosper. Bob / Leonard Nimoy. So anyway, anyone else? Welcome, Peter. There you go, Bob. All right, let's start with, so there's a short reading and then the 10 Commandments reading. And so I was thinking we could just go ahead and do it in two readers, but the second reader, make sure you have your, you feel like sharing your voice for a good few minutes there, because we go through it. But I want to make sure we don't rush through it. Let's really give it, let's appreciate each one here. So could I have two readers, two volunteers? The first one is a shorter one. The second one is the big one.
I'll do the shorter.
Okay. Marilyn, are you okay doing the longer one? The 10 Commandments? Okay. All right. So Bob, we'll share the screen here, and Bob, you start us off.
The Lord called to him from the mountain. Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation.
Thank you. All right, Marilyn.
Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall covet your neighbor's wife, male or female slave, ox, donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
All right, well, before we get into kind of what the 10 Commandments represent, I want you just to sort of reflect on the idea of, when the Israelites escape and they're liberated by God and they travel for several months and then they're camped out, all the complaining. And it happens fairly quickly in some ways, but I want you to sort of see if you can understand, or what would you think are reasons why they would complain like that, and what did they learn about what did they learn about themselves and following God as a result of that traveling across? And the reason I ask it like that is because we all can remember certain elements of the journey. You remember the manna story and that kind of thing. You remember how they at first loved that it was miraculous, and then they kind of started complaining about it and all that sort of thing. But tell me just overall, why you think they complain so quickly and what they learn because of that. And what do we learn by observing that? Boys?
I think sometimes we get impatient. You want to get on with it. You want to see the end. In a traveling trip, you hear in the back seat, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?"
That's
I
certainly
think
a
we're
part of
very
it.
impatient.
That's certainly a part of it, because it even says that they didn't take the most direct route that would have taken them through Philistines. They took an indirect route That's because God was concerned that they'd want to turn around and go back because they were too new at this. Okay, so there's some clues in there. I think that's real. What other reasons do you think they would complain? Why would they complain so quickly after all that? What is it? What are some reasons that you think? And this is just good because it gives us, I think, an entry point into then what the 10 Commandments are, why they're structured the way they are. Go ahead, Bonnie.
I think part of it can be human nature. You ask for something, you get it, but then you want something better, or you find fault like, well, I got this, but it's, look, somebody else has something better than I've got, or, whatever. I look back at maybe I had something before I left that I don't have now. And I think that was part of there. I mean, right. I'm trying to recall if they said, well, back in Egypt, we had this or we had that, and now we don't have that. So I don't know. It just seems like, we've done that ourselves. We pray that we get this house, then we get the house and we find all these things wrong with it. And why didn't we get a better house? And that kind of thing. I mean, I don't know. I think sometimes it's just human nature.
Some of that is human nature and some of it is cultivated by a culture. And I also would say, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. I will also say that I think you touched on something else too, this idea that we're always longing for something different and new, or a lot of times we are, but really we're also creatures of habit. And so we like security. And so when you step outside of your comfort zone, which truly this is a metaphor for that, it's only natural that we want to pull back at times. And it seems like there was an awareness of the fact that they would want to do that. So there was an attempt to try to hedge that. But nonetheless, the story contains these elements. Does it need to? Well, maybe it does. But it does seem like odd at first. And it's easy to point fingers. Oh, those foolish people. I read so many commentaries because I was looking to see what other people would say, scholars, whatever. So many of them saying, oh, well, it's just because they're faithless and sinful and all. And I'm like, okay, that's easy to cast all our judgments on them. But the truth is they are us. So that's why I asked the question. We don't need to read every detail of the story to appreciate the tendency of complaint in times where liberation, where growth, where change has happened. So getting behind it a little bit can be helpful because I think it's something we can all relate to and we can all learn from. Any other comments about what it is maybe that motivated the complaint? I think, one of the things is that I love the commentaries that talk about how it needed to take this long. They complain because it takes so long. It needed to take so long because it wasn't just about getting Israel out of Egypt, but it was about getting Egypt out of Israel and that sort of slave mentality. And that is so crucial. Removing the slave mentality. I want you to hold that idea as we look closer at the 10 Commandments, because that's so much what they're about, is getting out of the slave mentality, really living as liberated human beings. Jane?
Well, it was a big change, and we're all fearful and concerned about change in our life, and because we want to control how things go. And I think they must have felt very out of control. They didn't know what they were going to eat. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know how long it was going to take to get there. There was just so many unknowns for them. And as you were speaking, it made me realize that sometimes it's that journey from here to there in the midst of change that God teaches us, that God is trying to instruct us and teach us and help us trust, help us believe, help us give, that he will take us step by step if we will slow down. As Boy said, our patience level we have to slow down enough to try to discern what God is trying to teach us each step of the way of the journey.
Exactly. And that is, okay, it's hard enough for each of us as individuals to do that, but when you have a collection of so many different people with so many different opinions, I mean, I'll just use one example. It may not be the best example, but remember how at the beginning of the pandemic, how Anthony Fauci, maybe call him like a Moses-like figure, was looked at with such appreciation. And oh my gosh, he's helping us through this. And how long did it take before he became the whipping post for so many because of frustration about the direction of how things were being handled? I'm not talking about evaluating that. I'm just talking about the fact that it happens. And then all of a sudden you get to these places where half the people look at him as exactly the opposite of how he was perceived at the beginning, that sort of thing, how easily that happens. And because I think a lot of what Jane was saying, we have a need to control, we have a need to have a sense of direction and what's the end game. And it's not that these aren't fair concerns. It's just that if we're not aware of them, they can easily become the highest level of concern. And what the Ten Commandments try to teach and try to re-impress upon people is like, hold on, your sense of control and your sense of needing to know all the answers is not the highest level. Okay, this is not it. So this is what, here, focus on this, that sort of idea. That's kind of what the Ten Commandments are kind of about, but they emerge in that context of complaint. Okay, not just, hey, we're all so happy, we're free, yay, yay. No. It quickly goes into that place. And I think it's necessary because not only does it speak to human nature, but it also speaks to the realities of Israel, whether it's the reality of Babylon and the temptations of Babylon, but also just the general reality of people wanting to control what's happening. And when you're wandering around, it doesn't take long to end up, like Boy said, with a lot of backseat drivers. And that's where things can go off the rails. So the Ten Commandments is one way of trying to help people stay on those so-called rails. But as we look at the Ten Commandments, you know, and you just heard them read, and in fact, I'll ask this question and I'll call them back up again so you can look at it and just have them in front of you a little bit. But even though I know we can't quite see them all because of the way the script is, but as you look at them, you know, they offer a vision of how we are to live, to love, what our focus should be, and relate to one another. And if you could just kind of distill that vision, what is it that this, just in a bigger picture, step back, you know, from a mile or so, that view, what would be the vision that you see being presented here in the Ten Commandments, the overarching vision? Why are they important? Why have commandments? And if you want to talk, please just start talking. I apologize. I can only see like 5 of you on this because of the setup, but I wanted people to be able to at least see.
Well, it's a pattern for your life, how to live your life every day, and then you rest on the 7th day.
It's kind of like that. Yeah. I mean, it's got some aspects of that, but it's really basic. It's not so much pattern of, well, in some ways it's pattern. Some things are patterned of what to do, and then some are very much what not to do. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, so it's interesting to note, what is it that it's saying to do, and what is it that it's saying not to do, and how do those then relate? What is the vision that they are creating?
I think it's trying to create a vision of unity and a pattern for life, do and don't. And as Jane pointed out, you need control and guidance, just like kids. You tell them what they can do and they can't do.
That's true. And okay, so the purpose of telling children what they can and can't do, is it meant to constrain them? Is it meant just to tamp down their sense of freedom? What's the purpose of providing such guidelines? This is the vision.
Growth.
Huh?
They need to have that to grow.
Okay.
If you're constantly constrained, you can't grow.
And also to live harmoniously with other people, to get along with other people.
Right. Right. I mean, these are sort of the basics, aren't they? These the ones that have to do with do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery. Why them? Why not other things? What is it about them that is so essential? Why pick
Part of it's
those?
your own safety.
Okay, so safety, you think, is one of them?
Well, you tell children, don't run out into the street. That's for their own good. That's for their own safety, not because you don't want them to run and play. It's because you
Bigger
want to keep them
picture.
safe.
Yeah, but think bigger picture. That is absolutely true. But bigger picture, why is that important for a society, all these things, or for a group of people? Yes, for one person, it can relate to safety, although these are less about safety and more about what? These are general
I think they're more,
agreements. What was
I
that?
think, it seems to me that these all say, be one with God. Be with God. These are God's behaviors that he's expecting. And so by following them, you're all following and being one with God. You're not venturing away.
Okay. That's that is true. That is true. But what specifically is the focus?
Love.
Well, it is love. This is partly, that love is behind when we honor father and mother, when we don't murder our neighbor, when we don't commit adultery with someone. But what is it that it's all sort of about?
Survival of the nation.
Yeah, well, it has to do with all the covenants we make. Okay. And the covenants that we make with God has to do with God can set up our ability to be free. God can establish our freedom, but we still have choice. And as human beings, if we're going to abide by any covenant that allows us to move forward, then God can only do so much. And if we abide by certain things, then we also have to agree to certain covenants within our human society. And these are the basic ones, because if these are torn, or if we commit certain things, then we tear the fabric of our ability to be in relationship. Okay, then it becomes fractured. And that's when covenant is difficult to maintain. Okay, so all of these are designed to try to keep, as you've said, and you've all been saying this, it's just I wanted to get more specifically to the places that these are not designed to constrain us and to wag fingers and say, oh, you can't do that, you can't do that, you have to be that. No, it's not so much that. It's a recognition of an ancient wisdom where God understands where we are enslaved and where we are truly free, and that God can create free people. But we see too easily how we give ourselves to enslavement to other things. And so when we are enslaved, we are not free. We are not free to be our full our human selves. We are not free to be in our full relationship with God. So freedom is important. But then when freedom comes, when we experience freedom, we still have choice. And so we have to abide by certain things that keep us in our most whole and healthy way of being. So that's why these sort of like these particular categories are just like the basics, the real basics that you want to have a functioning society. You got to have this stuff covered. Otherwise, things fall apart quickly. Okay. Let me get back to seeing all your faces. So having said that, first of all, any kind of comments or reflections about that idea, disagreements even with it? I will always want to be sure to welcome anyone that has a different perspective on it, but any thoughts or ideas about that? Boyce, and then Barbara?
Well, I don't know if it's about what you said, but I find it interesting, and I never really thought about this before, that these commandments are really addressing the men. And that one statement of do not covet your neighbor's wife. I guess wives have the opportunity to covet their neighbor's husband, but not.
But you're right. Adultery was at that time exclusive to men because of the way they had the structure of society. You're right. You're right.
It just goes back to the ancient thought of women weren't that important to address, I guess. I don't know. But.
True. Thank you. Barbara, did you have something you wanted to add to?
This is just bringing it up into the modern day, but you would say that these commandments really were a rule of law for their time. And in order to have a society that functions, as you said, we need the rule of law. Otherwise, it's going to all go kaput and be chaos.
Absolutely. And we will find that even if it doesn't completely devolve into chaos for everybody, we will find that it is true that when we don't abide by the commandments, we find ourselves enslaved again. And with that in mind, even think for yourselves. In a modern context, what commandments do you find that you struggle with? What are some of these? How do the commandments challenge you? Now, I hope that none of you struggle with the idea of you shall not murder. But what about some of the other ones? What about the idols? What about having no gods before God? What are some struggles that you face? Carol?
I had, in a previous study of the 10 Commandments, the covet, thou shalt not covet, was explained in trying to keep up with the Joneses.
Yes.
And I think that's what I struggle with. You know, you see all these things and wow, you know, they have this, they have that. You go into the department stores and you need this, you need that. And that can be a struggle.
Oh my gosh, is it a struggle? And that's where, when Bonnie mentioned that as a product of human nature, I said, yes, I agree, but it's also quite cultural because our entire economy is based on creating that need that you just mentioned, and cultivating discontent is what steers the engine of our economy. Now, I say that, and I understand how that also motivates companies to continually offer improved products, to kind of continue to try to make things better. So there's a give and a take. But that one thing, the coveting, okay, if we struggle with that, how easily we can become enslaved to consumerism. See what I'm talking about? We become slaves again. When we don't covet, when we find contentment, we remain free. Other examples that you struggle with?
That just brought up credit card debt in my mind. You know, it's so easy nowadays to go out and just give them that card and buy whatever you want, but then you have to pay for it. And you may, depending on what it was, you could be paying for it for years.
Yeah. And it's that idea of, once again, of desiring, of coveting, of needing to have things, you know, not being able to separate the wants, needs, all that stuff, but it's all part of this cultivation. Okay. So it's not just that people are irresponsible. It's that we are shaping life to reflect that. One of the gods that I struggle with right here. A lot of us struggle with the gods of technology. And when we're honest, you know, don't place any gods before God. That's one that easily becomes a focus. And how many times, you know, less and less people are coming to church, but I see people all the time on buses, on trains, even in their cars, and they look like they're praying, but they're really just looking at their phone. But the thing is, we become slaves to technology. So freedom is what it's about. Jane?
I thought about the commandment of you must not tell lies about your neighbor or slander your neighbor and bear false witness and things like that, because I just, even thinking negative thoughts about somebody and judging them right or wrong, I think it is hurting myself, hurting my society, and I don't want to be a person that gossips and says negative things. I don't want to continue spreading negative information, and yet I do sometimes. I mean, in this politically divisive time, conversations all of a sudden get steered into some very negative, backbiting, terrible stuff. And I just want to walk away and say, no, I don't want to get into this, because as you use the terms, it cultivates discontent. That is what has happened in our society in a very infectious way. Everybody wants to cultivate discontent. And it's God knew what it would do.
Well, this
to
is
us.
it. This is the ancient wisdom that goes into shaping this, because slander is, first of all, it's a lie. But second of all, what does it do? It fractures society. It allows labeling, dismissing. It allows the otherizing of people. And when you do that, you get stuck in camps and you end up at the extreme with what Jane was naming, with what, unfortunately, we see a lot of today. And what happens then? We become slaves to those camps. And this is why I keep using the slavery image. I hope you're hearing this, because it is when we are enslaved, we cannot be the full following people of God. And so, yes, slandering and libel and speaking about neighbors like that creates a fracture of trust, a fracture of communication, a fracture of unity in our communities, in our nation, whatever, and it leads to ultimately to destruction. Now, ultimate destruction, I don't know. It leads to fracturing, though, which is a rending of the fabric of society. But you're seeing it. Look, we could probably keep coming up with examples, but that's the point. Is that it's so relevant. And when we really look at these, it's like, oh my gosh, they're so different. And yet they really are talking about something that's the same thing, right? That the first 4 commandments, when you look at them, those are the ones. And again, this might be where Ken was talking about how the Protestant and the Catholic churches divide them up. But in my reading of them, or what we just read, call on the first 4, they all have to do with God speaking about the people's freedom. Okay, God being the one who liberates. And in fact, it's in Deuteronomy where the rationale for the Sabbath is different. So in this one, it goes back to creation that says God created all that is in 6 days, and on the 7th day, God rested. Well, in Deuteronomy, the rationale for the day of Sabbath is because you were once slaves and now you are free. The point is only free people can choose to take a day off, to take a day of rest, not a day off, but a day of rest. Okay. That's the point. All those first 4 commandments have to do with living as liberated, free people. That's what's being established. But again, God can't, and it doesn't seem interested in wanting to control every other aspect of humanity. We are free. So God sets that part up, and then the rest of them, the last 6 or 5, depending on how you count them, the last commandments are all then about how basically we need to be able to relate to each other. Okay, there's so many other rules and agreed upon covenants that we need to have a functioning society, but at least these 5 or 6, we got to be able to agree on that. Okay, we got to be able to say you can't murder people and actually have a functioning society. You can't just go stealing willy-nilly from each other. Okay, you need to cultivate unity, trust, connection, these types of things. And as you look at them and maybe relook at them, see what it is that all of those are trying to shape. look and see deep. Oh, okay. I see that this is not about constraining our behavior. Oh, don't do that. Don't know. It's because when you do that, you are losing your freedom, your humanity, your ability to love and to be whole with God and before God. Okay. So that's something that can be an ongoing kind of a process here of looking at how these commandments relate to our modern way of living, but also just society in general. Any other comments about the 10 Commandments at this point? Marilyn?
I've never given a lot of thought to the one about not taking the name of the Lord in vain. But I have become more and more aware and really thinking about it this morning, how much, I mean, I'll say, oh God, or whatever, something went some way that I hadn't wanted. That I'm not quite sure what word to use, but that kind of delegitimizes or dishonors God when I do that. I mean, if I really think of my relationship with God as something very special, and I'm spewing out the name God when things haven't gone well, almost like I might say, oh, damn. I mean, which also really is dishonoring other people to be using a word like that. I've never really thought about it before, but boy, I sure am this morning.
Yeah, well,
that's
good.
I'm not the only one. I mean, our president does it all the time. And every time he does, that makes me kind of sit up and think about it.
It was only when I was in seminary that I started to really reflect on the same kind of thing too, because I remember having conversations with my grandfather and other people who were prominent religious, kind of influences in my life. And I used to feel the same way that, oh, when I say, oh God, is that taking God's name in vain? And that's where we have an issue. To me, then taking God's name in vain is a translation issue. Because really what that commandment is about is not just when we say, oh God, or, just, oh Christ, something like that. Those are desperation type things. And in fact, while I can agree that it can be like kind of belittling or a little bit demeaning, that is not necessarily taking in vain. That is still looking at, that's like a prayer of desperation. The commandment really is more about when we to say God's name and act like it has no power. That's what the whole commandment to not take God's name in vain is. So it's to present the idea that, hey, when you use the name of God or when you call on God, remember that this is a powerful name. Don't belittle it by thinking it's not, that sort of thing. So that's kind of more where it is. So it kind of leaves a little bit more room to have those times in our language that we kind of call out to God in those desperation things. But it's definitely, that's a source of ongoing conversation. And I think it does have to do with, look, what's the level of respect, or the Bible would use the word fear, but awe is the word. When we use the name, is it respect? Is it something that recognizes the power, the liberating power, to be specific, of God? If it doesn't, then that's where the commandment is saying, hey, check yourself, because if you start doing that, then you will forget. And if you forget how powerful our liberator God is, you're going to find yourself enslaved to another God. You see how it works? They're all connected to that idea of where our freedom is.
Okay, well, I guess I'm thinking of times when I really am, it's kind of a belittling kind of thing. It's using, it's saying, oh God, when I've spilled some milk on the counter, or, and I'm going to try real hard to stop doing that. I don't like the way that I'm doing it.
I think having consciousness and intention of our use of language can be quite liberating as well. And it can at least open us up to how many times we may be functioning in ways that are a little bit mechanical, and that way. And it's just when it's unexamined, it is easy just to keep rolling through it. And like you're saying, a lot of times we don't think about these things. I'm not saying we all need to do, more finger wagging with ourselves, but I do think consciousness helps us to be more, intentional and connected to our daily choices. And that is certainly what the commandments, I think, are inviting us into. Conscious, mindful.
Thinking of it as more of a as more important than something that I just finger wag at myself.
Yes.
There are plenty of things I can do that about.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that I've never given a lot of import or thought to that commandment. And for some reason, this morning I really am. Good. And I'm glad I am, and I'm going to stop doing it.
Yeah.
Carolyn, one thing you could do is just add, help me. And then it turns into a prayer. Yeah. Oh God, help me.
When I've spilled milk on the counter, I would rather just learn I don't know.
But he's helping you not be mad about spilling milk.
Right.
Oh, okay.
Because how easily we get frustrated about things that are unessential. I catch myself all the time reacting to stuff, and it is. And so that I like that approach, Boyce, because that is a helpful prayer. Say, why am I reacting as if this is the biggest deal right now? What is it? What's going on? And maybe to pay attention to that, to recognizes some places of imbalance or just inattention that could be healed. So yeah, it's good. And I think it's important to have conversation about it. Because this is the way that these commandments still are relevant in our lives, And look, we all know people who use the commandments like this. Okay, we all know people like that. But I think as we look more closely at them, we find that that's not their intention. It's not meant to kind of like just be social control and behavioral control. No, it's meant, the deeper vision, the deeper intention is this helps us stay as creatures, as people who are free, who aren't enslaved to something else, especially that we're not aware of. And that's the dangerous stuff. If we're not aware of how we're enslaved, then we're just going to stay enslaved. So that's, thank you.
It does help. I think they help one to be free from the standpoint, if you accept that everybody knows these things and that's the way we want people to behave, it allows us not to run around being afraid that somebody's going to kill us or somebody's going to do this to us or that this is going to happen, because we have these universal accepted behavior beliefs. It's right. Like driving your car. We don't fear that all of a sudden somebody's going to be driving in the wrong lane and smashing into us, because we all know, we drive on this side of the road or we drive on that side of the road. Now, there are people that foul up every now and then, but basically we're not in fear all the time of driving, because there's all these rules that if everybody knows them and follows them, it's safe.
But that's the point too of the 10 commandments. Yes, you're absolutely right. But that's where we have free will. And certain people do make choices whether to have too much to drink so that they find themselves driving down the wrong way on a highway, like you're saying, or certain people make choices like the young man did last week in Uvalde. So it's not that these rules absolutely protect us, but they remind us, look, you want to have a functioning, whole, free society, we have to be able to abide by these. And when these are not abided by, things fall apart. That's true. Bob, I saw your hand up. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I've been reading Horty's HarperCollins study Bible.
Yep.
And in regard to that commandment of don't take the Lord's name in vain, there's a different way he expresses this in this version. And it says, do not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. And to me, that means that you shouldn't use God in respect to something is wrong. That's the way I interpret that.
Something that's wrong. Yeah. I mean,
use God's name towards something that's wrong.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It gets a little subjective. And so that's one of the reasons that I like that definition of, don't use God's name as if it had no power. So like in a flip kind of way, because that to me keeps us focused on where is God's power located? Well, the first 4 commandments tell you. Each one says basically the same thing. I am the Lord your God, and I'm the one who frees you. I'm the one who frees humanity. So stay connected. You want to stay free? You stay with these, that kind of thing. But yes, there's a lot of ways there's some nuance within them that allows us to kind of have some subjective, connection to them as they apply to our lives. But yeah, that's one of the big, takeaways from today is that there's a lot of ways that we as modern people can find ourselves, to find our lives kind of opened up and enhanced, or even constrained or challenged by the 10 commandments. It's worth looking at them, and a lot of us kind of treat them like they're kind of just a thing on the side that we talk about when it's time to talk about whether or not we put them up in public spaces, that sort of thing. It's really, really, I think, beneficial for reasons that we've talked about, what Marilyn's discovered, what Bob's just said. There's ways that we see, oh my gosh, I hadn't thought about it like that. Those entry points are vital, because none of this is meant to be black and white. These are evolving places of wisdom. And by that, I mean, there's always ways that there's nuance, and we try them and we discover, oh my gosh, when I tried it this way, it taught me this, and that I was enslaved one way or another, or I created brokenness, or I discovered brokenness within myself, that sort of thing. So this is how it's meant to be. And it's unfortunate in some ways that the word Torah is universally called law, because one of the other proper translations of Torah is instruction. And there's such a difference between that. And the idea of law is so black and white. And instruction, while still clear, is less about the shame and that, and more about, hey, get in there and live and experiment, and you're gonna fall down. You're gonna find that life is gonna bite you sometimes, or you're gonna make mistakes. Well, then come back and use these as tools for reflection. Okay. Now, ultimately, you don't want to make the mistake, ideally, of murdering someone and then, oh, I guess I found out. That's why these are there, because these are some of the real basic ones. But for the most part, the Torah, the law, is meant to help us grow. Jane, others have used that word all through today. They're meant to help us grow into our fullest versions of ourselves in relation to one another, in relation to God. Okay, that's what the 10 commandments are for. There's one last thing I want to kind of go into, because it's kind of interesting. It's not from our reading for today, but we'll read it. I want you to read this portion of Exodus that has to do with Moses establishing the new covenant. I'll read it to you, and then we'll read another part that connects to it. So this is Exodus 24, 3-8. Moses went and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning, built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and set up 12 pillars corresponding to the 12 tribes of Israel. He sent young men of the Israelites who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed oxen as offerings of well-being to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins. Half of the blood he dashed against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. Moses took the blood and dashed it on the people and said, "Here is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." Okay. Before we go into the next part. So what, when you hear that, what does that have to do with? Like, where does that ritual come from? Just to make sure that we're all on the same page about it. What is that that covenant? What does that emerge from? Go ahead, Bonnie. I see you talking. Unless you weren't talking to us. But
I'm looking back at what you just said, just thinking the right thing. But wasn't that about the blood over the doorpost?
yeah. It's
to
connection to the Passover.
To the Passover?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. So I want to make sure that we were clear on that's where that comes from, that reestablishing, but it's a reestablishing of covenant. And so he's not only, so they use the blood, they separate it into basins, but then he puts it on the people. Now I know it's a little graphic, but he's sharing it with the people, okay? That this is now their covenant too. It's not a covenant on their behalf, but it's one that's now shared with them much more directly, okay? There's some interesting parallels then to what we read in the descriptions of what we call the institution of communion or the Lord's Supper. And we'll look at Luke real quick. And I just want you to see what parallels you can see between the ritual that Jesus talks about and what we just read that Moses is talking about, okay? Let's see, this is from Luke 22, 14 to 20. When the hour came, he took his place at the table and the apostles with him. He said to them, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer, for I tell you, I will not eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he said, "Take this and divide it among yourselves. For I tell you that from now on, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." Then he took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And he did the same with the cup after supper, saying, "This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." What parallels can you see between the Moses covenant and what Jesus is talking about? If any.
The blood is the sharing of the covenant with God.
Yes. And so what is Jesus doing and saying by saying it the way he does? Jane?
I understand it is he is now spilling his blood, creating a new covenant for all people. And
exactly.
Obviously we believe that it goes beyond just the Jews and the Israelites. It is for all people.
It's sort of it's using the same pattern of reestablishing the covenant.
The same sacrificial blood and the same use of blood and yeah.
Yes, that Jesus is using the imagery of the paschal lamb, which then Moses later uses to share the new covenant with the people in that special way. Jesus now takes that imagery, or at least Luke has Jesus take that imagery and kind of say, now I am that lamb, and I am the one who's sharing this with you. And much like the Israel, when they made covenants, they ate a meal to sort of galvanize the covenant. It's the same thing. Because why is a meal important? Why is it important to have a covenant be connected to a meal? Nourishment. What else about a meal is important?
Community.
What was that?
Community.
Yes. Who's there at the table? And it's this all sense of all. Yes. What else? Why is a meal so crucial to a covenant?
It sustains you.
Yeah. How many times do we have to eat? Some of us 3 times a day, but we have to eat regularly. So every time we have a meal is an opportunity to renew the covenant. okay? Not just the Passover meal, but every meal. That's really what grace is. You know how we say grace sometimes before meals? Yes, it's to say thank you, but it's to renew relationship. It's to renew covenant. So meals were so crucial for that, because every time there's a covenant, there's a feast and that kind of deal, because it's a way of reminding us, it's an opportunity for human beings who need to eat every day to invigorate, to remind, to renew the covenant with God. So Jesus is doing much the same thing that Moses did. Moses sort of took the initial covenant, the Paschal Lamb covenant, that promised that the angel of death would pass over, and then he moves it and it opens it and shifts it. Jesus takes that same imagery, moves it, shifts it, renews it, offers a different understanding. Okay, that's the way covenant often happens. Yes, it was this way, now it's this way. It was that way, now it's this way. It keeps evolving, it keeps opening. And that's the way God's relationship with humanity has been. And that is, to me, one of the reasons why I love that idea of God is still speaking. Because what other covenants are being written on our hearts today? It's not that it stopped. So how is covenant being written within us? That's something I'd like you to chew on, because the commandments weren't intended to be, this is it, do this and you're good. No, what they are is a gateway to depth. These aren't all the rules that help to establish what functioning, beautiful, full human society and human life are. They're the basics. This is just the foundational stuff. This gets us in, to the room of exploration. So then what is it then? What are the covenants that we make? What are the explorations? The commandments just get us started. The rest of our life is where the meat or the fruit is. So that's what I would invite you to look at. What are the ways that you find yourself renewing your covenant with God? And the covenant specifically would be how you are continually stepping into freedom. Okay. Knowing that we all find our ways to places of slavery, we fall down, we're not all getting it right. But when you find freedom, isn't it sweet? There's something so powerful about liberation. And it's liberation of the heart, it's liberation of the mind, it's liberation of the body, so many different ways. So I want you just to see, just open up to seeing how is a renewal of your covenant with God and with neighbor happening? How are you noticing it? Because I believe that when we set this intention, all of a sudden you will start noticing ways, and you'll be like, oh my gosh, I've been living a lot of my life, perhaps, being kind of unaware of how many places of reestablishing covenant that I'm doing. And only when we're aware of it, I think that's when the growth happens. Kind of like what, Marilyn, you started with that today, with just even the awareness of how you use language, in terms of your relationship with God. And Jane, your awareness of the frustrations that happen in certain relationships with people that lead to fracturing. So then where is the reestablishment of covenant? Sometimes it's not always about reestablishing covenant and reconnection. Sometimes we have to keep our distance. Sometimes we have to create a break, at least for a time, in certain conversations. But if that's the end of the story, then that doesn't lead to life. That doesn't lead to growth, perhaps. But where are the places then where we're invited to renew that covenant, to open up again, to discover something new, to keep growing? That's what I invite us to consider this week. And when we come back, let's see what we discover. Let's see how the covenant has been reborn in us, perhaps, or just little things that we've noticed. Okay. Any questions about that, or any kind of last comments about what we covered today? All right. Well, for next week, we're going to continue. We'll do week 5 of 6. So there's two classes left. We'll be reading Numbers chapter 14, verses 2 to 4, and then Exodus 18, verses 13 to 27. I will put the notes now in PDF for you all, but Bob, I will send you the last week's notes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Email and anyone else who wants them. So just reach out to me if you want notes in a different form from previous weeks. All right, friends, as always, it's a joy to do this with you. And I wish you peace and the love of Christ until we meet again. Bye-bye.